So what we've got today in terms of this meeting is members of a core group who've been working on the open space strategies and the place sufficiency assessment. And many of you have engaged in this process so far, either through discussions we were having through the heads of planning and the improvement service, through the wider group discussions as well. And we're really starting to look at that quality dimension. And Kristin will say a lot more, but I think just as a kind of opening into this, we know quality is one of the most challenging aspects of the open space audit. Probably will cease to become won't be the most challenging element once we move on to place sufficiency assessments, but there may be opportunities for integrating the two together. But certainly when we were looking with colleagues around quality assessment and whether there was a need for updating guidance and so on, we have views which span an absolute spectrum, from one end saying don't do anything that affects my baseline. My baseline is all I care about. I don't care what happens anywhere else. My baseline is precious to me. From other stakeholders who are saying, absolutely, it really would be good to have a standardized approach to how quality is being assessed. And that's particularly coming from some of the national agencies and other stakeholders who have a geography that's working across wider local authority areas. So that's the kind of challenge in terms of where we're starting from today. And so we haven't come to you with here is an answer and we're looking to check with you. We are still at the point of working through this, and so because the local authority colleagues who've joined us are actively working on open space work just now, we thought it'd be really useful to have your insights. So we are looking for collective brainpower to help us shape and steer a way forward and to find a way of balancing those two ends of the spectrum. So what I'll do is I'll hand over to Kristin to give us a bit of an overview in terms of existing approaches and frameworks. I then primed our LA colleagues to maybe say just a wee bit about what they've been doing on quality in their areas, and then really leaving that open to discussion and quite flexible about how that goes in terms of how we can move forward in terms of the potential for standardising approaches and where there are gaps in guidance that we can potentially fill. So my last kind of domestic instruction is, if you're not speaking, if you can pop your mic on mute, I think we all have, just so we avoid any feedback, and I'll hand over to Kristin.
Hi everyone, can I just check the slides come up for you all?
Yeah, we've got the slides, but you've just now popped your mini screen of people are on top of the slides. So I think it was working perfectly before, and now we've lost that bit. So if you minimize that. So I think it just means you don't see us. That's perfect. You're fine
okay
now, Kristin. Sorry. Yeah.
Always a little blip. Well, thanks, Julie. And as you sort of indicated there, quality has always been that kind of tricky issue to kind of pin down and for us to tick off. But yes, as Julie was saying, it'd be really good if we can kind of all work together and just see how we could best cover this in any new guidance if we prepare that to support the regulations and the new duties. So I just want to do a quick reminder of the spaces that we're looking at when we're thinking about assessing quality. And as many of you in authorities will know, the main basis is the PAN 65 typology. And we're keen for the place efficiency assessment, but also take a kind of holistic place-based approach and to look at how it can make best use of the open space and the audit data as well. And we want to see, how we can be most efficient so that when there's the site assessments being done, when you're looking at those sites and the sort of indicators, that it can filter through to both of the duties. Whilst recognising that some criteria may be more or less relevant to different types of spaces. And this is just kind of following on from some of our discussions at the workshops last year, and just looking back at PAN 65's essential elements of an audit. And those are the types of things that we'll probably see feeding through into the draft regulation. But given what some authorities' views were a bit mixed on how prescriptive we should be, I think for the ones in the lower half of the screen, there'll be a bit of flexibility that these are things that planning authorities may include information about. But, and you can see sort of highlighted there in pink is sort of play opportunity. So that's the one that's not in PAN 65, but that we're keen to kind of have that read across. Yeah. And this was the photo, the image that Julie mentioned earlier. And you can see on the screen, this was a meeting back in her offices in Stirling, where various people around the table produce the various bits of guidance that they look at and refer to. And certainly when you see it there, and then there's others still that weren't put down on the table that day, it does look like quite a lot. But actually, when you start to look at the ages of some of these pieces of guidance, they are aging quite a bit now. So as you can see, most of the guidance is actually pre-2012. So by the time the new duties come into force next year, this guidance will be going back sort of 10 years plus. So we just want to kind of look and see if it needs any refresh. And also, this table comes from the State of Scotland's Green Space report, where they looked at all the different approaches that authorities have been using. And you can see here that the quality guide, the Green Space one, is the most popular, and it's also being used in combination with other bits of guidance, whether that's CABE or with Green Flag or with more bespoke options. And that other authorities are using combinations of green flags and liams or bespoke in their own. And then there was others where we weren't quite sure what approach they were using. And then there was an outlier using a household survey. So it kind of poses the question, are there sort of gaps in the guidance, or that is kind of causing authorities to take this kind of mix and match approach or to develop their own bespoke options? So is there a need for a refresh? And we asked this question at the local authority workshop last year. And again, as Julie indicated, there was some mixed views, but generally it was quite a positive reaction that sort of further guidance around assessing quality would be helpful, would be useful, but that it shouldn't be too prescriptive. But again, there was some sort of mixed views. But since most of that guidance was produced, we've had sort of new drivers, the declaration of the climate emergency, greater focus on health and well-being, particularly in light of the pandemic, you'll all be familiar. We've got that link across to the place efficiency assessments of playability, which is maybe a kind of new dimension for looking at open spaces. And a sort of greater focus on sort of community engagement, and it not just being a sort of officer's judgment, but seeing how we can get community views onto the quality of their spaces in their area. So when we spoke previously, we thought that any new guidance would maybe link to the kind of outcomes-based approach which will be taken forward in the regulations, and that in doing that, that could be a way to help authorities demonstrate how they're thinking about the various outcomes. So for the next few slides, I'm going to do a quick run through of some of the existing guidance. And it's interesting to see that there's quite a lot of similarities between the various different documents, although some of them are looking at place through their particular lens, whether that's sort of health or play or different dimensions. So just starting with the 6 qualities of successful places, which is in our own Scottish planning policy, and also comes through into our green infrastructure design and placemaking guidance. Now, when we wrote that, it was mainly focused on master planning, but actually a lot of the points are actually relevant to looking at the quality of open spaces. So if they're welcoming, have a good sense of place, deliver quality through design, create multifunctional spaces, and connections for people and wildlife. And the Green Space Quality Guide has similar themes around accessible and connected, attractive and appealing places, biodiversity as well. And it also looks at sort of particular features within the spaces. And CADE, again, quite similar, has a specific section on health, and also looking at how the spaces meet the needs of people of different ages and backgrounds. Green flag, so 4 authorities use green flag in some form. And again, we can see that some of the 6 qualities around welcoming, safe and pleasant are coming through. It's also some of the outcomes that we're looking at, so around sort of health and also climate change adaptation. And it's got more of the marketing and promotion side, which probably wouldn't be a planning requirement. And linked to that, we've got LIAM, and it's got a strong focus around litter. Then the Green Space Health Outcomes Framework, again, touches on some of the outcomes that we're looking at around inclusion, and also picking up around places being well connected and accessible, and linking to the wider green network. And I also wanted to put in here the guidance from Play Scotland's toolkit around assessing play opportunities. And although it's very much looking at the play quality, there are, again, very similar themes coming through here around sort of location, accessibility, and looking at environmental factors, so quality, but then looking at the specific play opportunities and qualities of the space. And place standard, and it's got the tagline, how good is our place? And could that be how good is our green space or our open space? And when you look at the wheel, some of the sections really jump out as being directly relevant to assessing open spaces and play. But actually, as you work around the wheel, there are other sections that are also relevant around facilities, social contact, identity and belonging, care and maintenance. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but you can see that some of the prompt questions are quite relevant and could apply to play in open spaces. So things like, are the public spaces, so we could read that as open spaces, make a pleasant experience? Are there positive features that make the place look attractive? Are there a variety of spaces, opportunities for contact with nature, and really sort of good quality and well maintained as well? So those are the sort of those core ones that are perhaps most relevant to open space and play, and then also some of those other ones. So I've also been working with Building with Nature, who, as you may know, are currently looking to refresh their standards. And again, whilst that's mainly used for assessing policies or new development, quite a lot of these principles are sort of relevant to open space as well. Yeah. So one way that we can start to try and look at what's in all those bits of guidance and to maybe bring that together is to look at it sort of in relation to the outcomes. And we can start to populate some of the guidance points under each of the outcomes. So under the improved access to a range of types of open space, you can start to see sort of a few themes coming through, and you can group some of these points under sort of 4 headings. So there's something about having access to a variety of multifunctional spaces. The spaces being well located and sort of ease and safety of getting there. Access within the space, for example, paths and entrances, and also in relation to disabled access. And around the improving equality and eliminating discrimination theme, again, there's sort of various themes that come through to me. So there's something about equal access to all, and again, that's the DDA requirements and things like provision of seating, so sort of maybe older people or people who need to take a rest as part of their journey, have that opportunity. There's something about feeling safe and welcoming. And there may be more important factors for different groups or for women, so things around natural surveillance, lighting, or indeed for children to feel welcome to play in the space. Community involvement to ensure people's specific needs, including vulnerable groups, are considered. And there's something about how it feels and what impact that space has on the community in terms of having a positive impact, or wherever it feels like it's a space suffering from sort of disadvantage, if there's signs of vandalism or the space just feeling generally neglected. And actually, this is the sort of continuation of what the other bits of guidance say in relation to this theme. So there's quite a lot out there actually around sort of tackling discrimination. And in relation to health and well-being, again, there's themes around if there's an opportunity to take part in different sports, play or recreation opportunities. Opportunities for social contact and spaces to meet. And then thinking about maybe more negative health features, whether it's air or noise pollution or dog fouling. And safety again, so personal safety, and something around risk in terms of sort of health and well-being. Now we've got the outcome around climate change. And actually, when I was looking at what the various bits of guidance say, I think this is perhaps not coming through as strongly in some of the guidance given their age, but some of the newer and more emerging guidance, for example, building with nature, is definitely thinking about mitigation and adaptation and climate change. And Green Flag also particularly looks at climate change adaptation. And then securing positive effects for biodiversity. And again, there's various points coming through across the guidance around connections for wildlife, diversity of habitat. And it's quite interesting that even the play guidance particularly looks at habitats and how that can provide stimulating, interesting places for children to play, but also those homes for nature as well. Now, the final outcome is around successful, sustainable places. And again, given the sort of holistic nature of place, a lot of what's gone before could really come under that heading as well. But what I've tried to do is pull out some of the different elements that we've not been touched on already. So perhaps things around the spaces being more distinctive and reflecting their landscape quality. In terms of sort of providing an attractive setting for the place and sort of around maintenance and stewardship. So, and again, there's quite a lot around that theme, so I won't go through it again, but it's just around those kind of more place-making ideas. And this is my final slide, and it isn't final or polished, but just thought there's something interesting here around there being 6 outcomes, the sort of 6 aspects that may be included in the audit, and the 6 qualities, and just starting to think about how they might marry across and potentially match up. So in the last sort of box here under 6 qualities, you could either split the qualities up to kind of link directly across to the outcome. But actually, another approach would be to kind of say, well, the 6 qualities particularly linked to that final outcome. So there's different ways of sort of cutting the cake. But I hope that's just a useful sort of run through of what guidance we've sort of already got out there and how it sort of fits together.
Thank you very much for that, Kristen. That was really helpful to see that in that way. And I think, you know, I was minded as you were talking about a phrase that was mentioned at a meeting recently in a local authority area, which was talking about them having an embarrassment of strategies, you know, lots and lots of strategies, but not necessarily things happening. And actually, when you start to see those collated in that way, you start to see where there are synergies and alignment between them. So there is quite a lot of guidance, a lot of different tools and frameworks, but quite a lot of commonalities between them that we could draw on. And I think just before I open the floor, I probably should just say it was interesting to hear Brodie in the background there reminding us that there are other users of green space as well, which need to be assessed, and dog walking and various other activities.
Sorry about that.
As well. No, good. So anyway, before I move to ask our local authority colleagues to kind of tell us a little bit about what's happening in their particular geographies, I just wanted to open the floor first off, just to see if anybody has any immediate kind of comments or feedback that they would like, that's been prompted, things that came into your mind when Kristin was running through that presentation. So as there's a few of us, if you are able to raise your hand, if you've got something you want to say, and I will then bring you in. I was going to say, Kwan, I can't believe we were all sitting there going, oh, I'm just stunned by that. So Kwan, come on through.
Right, I'll just start the ball rolling, really, just to say that when Kristin was going through the slides on the climate slides, where the kind of the older guidance probably didn't bring out that aspect a bit more, and play standard at the moment, the core tool hasn't focused a lot on the climate stuff either. But we are, just to update that, we are in the process of developing the kind of the climate lens over the play standard tools. So hopefully in time, we'll get a set of enhanced prompts, I suppose, that's highlighting more of the climate factors to consider. Okay, that's me.
I think that element of that approach of a lens, because it is that element. I remember early discussions when we're developing the quality guide around what was the purpose of the spaces, what was the function, and understanding that first is that actually, if you look through a range of different lenses, it puts a slightly different nuance onto some of those different dimensions. So I think holding that concept of a lens is actually quite helpful. Number of hands now. If I bring in Ali C, then Emma, and then Sue.
Hi, thanks, Julie. I mean, I think it's always, as always, just to make the point that it's, there's a very fine balancing act here between gathering enough information to allow you to make decisions that need to be made against, the resource involved in gathering that information and doing something. And you want ideally to be in a situation where local authorities take ownership and do this work themselves, rather than what happened historically, where you have, it's so cumbersome and onerous that you have 2 or 3 consultancies that corner the market in it, and you just get these kind of replicate audits and strategies across the country. So it needs to be, given how local authorities are up against the wall in terms of staff resources, it needs to be a manageable process, not with just a massive suite of, criteria and onerous processes to go through. So I mean, I know you know this, but it just needs to be, there is a fine balancing act here that needs to be doable in fairly short order, in a way that gathers the information you need to be able to make strategic decisions. So it's not an exact science. You just need to get a kind of, a feel for different spaces and what they do and don't do.
Yeah, absolutely, Ali. And I think when I was originally looking through all the various bits of guidance, it does feel a bit overwhelming, and I originally put it all into like an Excel spreadsheet and kind of it went, scroll down the page. So I think it's about looking at what's there and what the specific indicators can then maybe reflect various outcomes. So if you see a particular feature, how it can relate across. And I think probably, Julie, we're going to get into hopefully maybe more discussions around what are those indicators and things to be looking for, which can then help. There can be almost like there's like a logic of how that then filters into the outcomes as well. So we are definitely wanting to see how we can make this feel not too onerous, but be worthwhile.
Yeah.
And definitely, I think there's the value of that kind of institutional knowledge of the authorities doing this themselves rather than just outsourcing it. Absolutely.
No, I think absolutely. And that element around pragmatic and manageable approach really comes into this. And I think even worse than Ali talking about the consultants is when you end up finding that you either get students taken on for the summer, and it is basically 2 students who just spend, who go round, cycle around all the spaces, tick, 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 and so it's not necessarily engaging users within that as well. So I think there's an interesting thing that we want to take here around, there was a plethora of elements. Are there some key indicators that we might start to pull out? I think would be a useful thing to hold. So on that one, I'll hand on to Emma. There was quite a bit of nodding and smiling going on as Ali was talking.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with Ali more on that one about the data. I mean, we're having to manage this, essentially me and one other person, and I'm doing the audit. And we're down to 170 spaces, and that was us being ruthless. And I'll get onto that a bit later. My point here I wanted to make, when Kristen was referring to DDA compliant, something me and my colleague have been sort of tossing back and forwards a bit without actually coming up with any answers, is the gender element of that. And we've been doing some reading around that, because obviously it's coming up a little bit in the news, and there's there's a project making spaces for girls, which I found quite useful. And I found that very useful, but I'm not sure anyone's necessarily come up with answers on that. But I just thought it might be something we need to acknowledge explicitly, because there are very large gender differences even for children, not necessarily younger children, but when you're getting to preteen and teen, that's where the use of spaces and perceptions of how spaces work and whether they're fulfilling needs are affected by gender. So anyway, it was just, I wanted to drop that in there.
I think that's a really helpful comment, Emma, and it does tie in with a piece of work that's going on just now with the regulations, looking at the inequalities impact assessment around those as equalities impact assessment. Sorry, I put inequalities in because, and it is highlighting a range of those things that aren't necessarily always explicitly considered, and I think that will help us frame our mind. But certainly from our work we've done with young place changes, that gender issue around teenage girls and use of space is really quite a significant one, and very relevant when we're coming into playability of spaces as well. Okay, Sue, can I bring you in?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks very much, Kristen. I think that was a really, really useful summary, and I think seeing everything brigaded like that against the outcomes across that plethora of guidance was immensely helpful. I'm just wondering, would you be able to share the PowerPoint, please? There's so much in that. I think that presentation would be useful to have a closer look.
Yes, I will. I would just take out the building with nature slide, because they're still working on their own guidance. But everything else I can share.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks. And Tom, can I bring you in?
Hi, yeah, I was just to echo what Sue said. I thought that was really, really helpful just to see how much is out there and how much it kind of brought home to me, because I haven't started thinking about quality, to be honest, in terms of I'm just seeing what is out there and trying to do a visit to them all. So what criteria do we use? So for me, it just seems there's so much out there. So what one do you pick? It might be a case that we try and wait to see what the regulations say, because it is quite, I don't want to miss anything, to be honest, and I'd be keen to hear what other people are thinking about doing if they're updating their quality stuff in the future. But I suppose that's for the next thing. But yeah, just to echo that, it was really interesting what you said, Kirsten. I'd equally like to see that table that has the stuff in it.
Yeah, absolutely happy to share all that. Just on the kind of regulations, so we probably won't see a lot on quality within the actual legislation itself. We'll have some aspects that have got to go into the audit, and will indicate that there should be a kind of quantity, quality, accessibility assessment. But it will be more the guidance side that will start to get into more of the how-to, I guess, and the types of considerations. And I guess we're keen to kind of have this conversation with you guys today and just see what goes into that, and whether it's signposting to different bits of guidance, or whether it's pulling together certain indicators and saying, well, these are the ones you should really we think would be helpful, from these discussions. So that's it. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And if I can bring Ivan in, and I think Ivan was one of those people who's been round every green space in Edinburgh at one point doing those assessments, weren't you, Ivan?
Back in the day. Yeah, I mean, there is this spectrum of views as to whether we could somehow start all over again and produce the most perfect bit of guidance that everyone should follow, and then at the other end, people come up with their own ways of doing things. I think what Kristen's done already is incredibly useful. And I hate toolboxes, but it starts to become a menu of different approaches you could use. I think in terms of guidance, what we should do is look at where it's been successful and time efficient, and there are good examples out there of where audits have been done, pragmatic, prioritized, time efficient, and say to folk, well, these are the approaches that have worked for other people. This is the bit of guidance, or this is the particular methodology from the particular bit of guidance that was really useful for them. But so I think that's the sort of thing I'm thinking of in terms of guidance. Again, the signposting, rather than and a thing that perhaps does fill in some gaps in terms of new drivers. And I think we should. I mean, I think it was interesting. You're looking at the 6 of this and 6 of that and 6 of the other. I think it might be a bit of a mistake to try and sort of retrofit lots of different things together. But and just thinking about for example, the 6 elements of successful places is actually quite weak in terms of nature rich and in terms of positive effects of biodiversity. So I think there's probably a gap there. Some of the gaps on renewable energy are being filled now with park power and so on. So yeah, filling gaps, pointing people to best practice and things that have worked, I think, rather than let's sweep it aside and come up with some. I mean, it'd be nice to start again, but it would probably take about 5 years.
Yes, I'm kind of wondering if it's not necessarily a start from scratch, but we've got a lot of pieces of Lego already that we could start pulling the right pieces together on that one. Because it's interesting, the other thing that I was reflecting when Kristin was talking was that starting the strong link between a quality framework and some of those outcome measures, because again, I remember some of the local authority colleagues being quite supportive of an outcomes-based approach, but also a little bit concerned about how are we actually going to show that we've actually achieved that. And I think I've obviously spent too long with colleagues in Public Health Scotland, and I can starting to see a logic model element coming in here from those outcomes that we could actually start nesting back in. Gosh, that was a bit spooky. Just as I said, Public Health Scotland, Ali appeared in the lobby at that point. It was obviously like it's a little call signal going out there. But it was just that. So welcome, Ali. You're Ali Mack for the day, as we've got Ali Corbett in as well. Do you want to just pop and say hi? Thanks. Yeah, so we're just talking a little bit about initial responses to the presentation that Kristin's just given us, and I shared that with Ali as I knew she was coming in a wee bit later, but just starting to talk about how we're already starting to see that, starting with the outcomes and that potential of mapping back to what some of those key indicators might be, and that linkage between quality and outcomes, and how we might actually then start monitoring, evaluating some of those strategies as well. So Emma, you had your hand up, I think, briefly.
Yes.
Yes.
Just when you were talking about that and the link between the indicators and the outcomes, for me, the interim step is sort of a side branch from this, which is the link to design standards. So looking more, because planning has more influence over new spaces than it does over existing spaces, beyond protecting the fact that the existing space is there. But when it comes to what changes within existing places, we have less influence than other parts of the council. So looking at it purely from a planning perspective, it's the translating whatever our quality standards are that we use in our audit has to tie directly to what we're then asking developers to put into new development. Because if they don't translate across, when we then later assess those sites, it doesn't work.
Okay, yeah. That's a really helpful comment there in terms of the practicalities of using it. And it just reminds me of something else. another piece of work, research that's going on, Rich Mitchell and other colleagues, we got excited. They were doing a piece of work around green space quality, but it's actually around green space qualities, and it's looking at the characteristics and features within green spaces, because again, they were looking from a research perspective of green space is good for health and well-being, but actually if you were then talking to a developer about, well, what would you actually need to create, what exactly is it in terms of how many trees, what sort of canopy cover, what sort of species, and so on. So that's a piece of work that they're working on just now, and I think that there are some of those other interim steps between there. So Ivan, you've got a hand up, and I didn't know if that's a legacy hand or if you're wanting to come back in. The hand vanished. It was a legacy hand. Okay, so one of the thought that's coming in, if we can kind of hold in our minds, is actually I was also thinking about some of those indicators that Kristin was talking about that could actually fit in more than one box. And I'm kind of thinking again about that mapping exercise, is whether there's almost a hierarchy in there and there are certain key indicators which would actually feed to several different measures. So I mean, that's something again that we could start exploring and go a little bit further on. But if nobody's got any more immediate comments in terms of that kind of overview that you kind of wanted to share now, I think I will turn us to that element of practicalities and pragmatism, and actually ask our local authority colleagues who've joined us today to say a little bit about what you've been doing in your area, some of the challenges you're experiencing, and some of the opportunities you've perhaps identified of how you can do this in a much more streamlined and efficient way. And Ajalanka, can I ask you to kick off in terms of what you've been doing in Perth and Kinross?
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned before, this will be our first open space audit. So we are a bit behind in terms of not having something to build on already. And we have done our quantity and accessibility, well, not the full audit, but we mapped everything we have. We've done the accessibility analysis through GIS. So we are on to now the quality part. And we've developed our own sort of assessment spreadsheet for this. And I think it just almost happened organically that we went for an individual approach, because we had several different versions that people then were, you know, inputting to shaping in different ways. And it just so happened that it's not one of the standards, it's a little bit combining them all. And we've been working on this with our green space colleagues. So that's the team who's responsible for maintenance of public open spaces, and they don't have, so their assessment process are very much focused on, are the bins good quality, is there enough seating, whereas we wanted to steer that into a sort of more like a broader approach. And what all the criteria which Kristin mentioned, we try to incorporate those. And I don't know if it would be easier if I share this with you, because we actually have a draft template.
Please do. Yeah, you should be able to share your screen. I think we're set up so everybody can.
So I don't know if it's maybe too small to
if
really
you could zoom in a wee bit.
Yeah. But the main point is that we have 4 big categories so far. So that's accessible and well connected, attractive and appealing, biodiverse, supports ecological networks, and community use. But I think these detailed criteria which we have next to each of them, these could be sort of grouped in any way you like. So, you know, that wouldn't probably be a problem for us to rejig this template. I just highlighted a few, which, for example, could be under diverse. So we want to look at if there's varied landscape elements, if there's a diversity of different habitats, if there is a sense of local identity. So all these things, I suppose, could be under a different heading. What we've also done is thought about the assessment method. And as you'll see, there's quite a lot which you can't really assess through site visit, without site visits. And we've been talking to our green space colleagues who unfortunately don't really have the capacity to incorporate this in their daily jobs. So we are probably looking at bringing someone else on board. We also didn't want to do it with consultants or with just summer students, but we have been thinking about taking on graduate landscape architects for a shorter sort of half a year period initially maybe, who could then be working with our landscape architect colleagues and do these site visits together. So that's a bit of, making sure that it's not just the tick box exercise, but there's also some consistency. So it's the same people doing the assessments. But we will have to ask for this resource, and who knows if we get it or not. In terms of the scoring, we wanted to score against, if you like, how good this place could be. So instead of knocking out some of the indicators for different types of spaces because they're less relevant, or setting up a sort of, like a criteria of what should the park achieve, what should the play space achieve, we just said, well, really what we want to know is what could be done to this green space to achieve its full capacity. So the idea is that we would record notes of existing conditions and a description of what the site is like now. And then as part of your assessment, you would include potential improvements. And this is what we are really interested in as a council. What else? I will stop sharing this for now. Yeah, I guess the other thing we were thinking about is, because we also have a lot of green spaces, is how we would prioritize them, whether based on typology or maybe based on locations. So one of the ideas have been that we would create clusters of green spaces and we would assess them together, like how well they function in that neighborhood, and then come up with place-based strategies based on that, rather than sort of score each green space on its own and then potentially miss those connections. So that's the kind of thinking so far, but we've only done a very quick trial of this and conversations are still going on. So yeah, just to note that this is a very rough draft, but that's the kind of initial ideas.
That's really helpful, thanks. And I'll do the ask, as I'm sure Kristen will as well, is just to say, if you're able to share with us those criteria, recognising that they're draft, that would be really helpful to do that. And I think there's a couple of really interesting things within there. It's particularly thinking about not just assessing the quality of the space now, but what is the future potential of that space is really important. And that element of clustering sites, because a while back there was a lot of discussion focused on multifunctionality, and we should try to increase the functionality of every site, and then concerns about, actually, if you try to do that, will it actually meet everybody's needs, or do you just kind of get a grey average out of that? And actually, are we better off looking at that neighbourhood level? And there may be some sites which, because of their size or because of their nature, are perhaps particularly good in terms of mental health, relaxation, access to nature, and other sites might be better for those sort of active sports and so on, rather than trying to make every site do everything. So I think there's some interesting things there, but quite challenging, to look at how to do that. But I think as we're starting to think about policy drivers of 20-minute neighbourhoods as well, that cluster, that place approach, it's really helpful. Kristen, do you want to come in and ask a question?
It was just a comment, just to say that one of the other parts of the strategy that's set out in the legislation is that assessment of current and future requirements. And I definitely thought it was probably something in that of what the requirements of what's needed in the future, and then what you were saying around sort of improvement. So maybe sort of links across there as well.
Yeah.
But it would be great to see that as well.
Yeah. And Kwan?
Hi, thanks, Hanaka. I think that looks really quite interesting, and especially quite taken by the 4 dimensions, sort of that you kind of split the assessment into, and the community use. So that particular section, I suppose, from my own personal kind of interest, is that where you start to pull in children's playing as one of the kind of aspects as well that you try to look at or audit?
Yeah, and that is the section as well where we would bring in the public consultation element. One of the sort of ways of getting this information there was public consultation, and that's one that we haven't figured out yet how we're going to do it, because in a way we would like it to be focused. So maybe we will ask specific questions about elements that we can't ourselves survey or evidence properly, or maybe we focus on specific sites or do it on a neighborhood basis. So any advice on that would be really helpful too. And definitely the play element is one that you can't evidence. I don't think in any other way. You can look at it and sort of have criteria which are helpful, and you can try and spot these different ways of improving the space, but really it's the user experience that would come into play there.
Yes, and I think potentially as well in future you can develop that and link it into things like local place plan and community planning, and in terms of what community thinks those spaces could be improved or could be bring into use, I suppose. Yeah, no, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that was one of the comments we kind of got. We're looking to find across was how people had involved views of community, views of users in those assessments. Because I do remember many years ago, actually now, there was a tool called GreenStat, which Greenspace in England had developed, which again was allowing user feedback. But when they ceased to exist, that tool vanished, and that was trying to provide a structured way of doing it. And I'm thinking again of Edinburgh. They do use the green flag, but all of their a large number of their friends groups are trained as green flag assessors, and so they can assess other parks, and that's about community involvement and creating a larger capacity from their volunteer network there. Just some other things to think about. But I'm going to move on to Emma now, because I did think about you, Emma, when Henrika was talking about how you prioritize, and I know that's one of the things that you were struggling with that capacity, and how on earth do we do all of that? So can you tell us a wee bit about what you've been doing in Midlothian?
I think the short answer to that is slowly. This is taking us a lot longer than we anticipated, but so we're currently revising our open space strategy, which was last done in 2012 off the basis of work done by Ironside Farrer on our open space audit, which was carried out in 2008-2009. We have a history of not doing things particularly rapidly in Midlothian. But we'll get there. So what we've done is we're carrying that forward. One of the big changes we've made this time as a result of the discussions I discovered through this group is we have dropped our threshold from 0.4 hectares to 0.2, which has massively increased our number of sites. And we've had to go through that. I've actually had to go through and redo our typology as a result, because our typology based on Pan 65 wasn't particularly working slickly with that. The main change I've had to do is around amenity green space. So even with residential, we were left with some of our 0.2 and above hectare residential amenity space is not functional in terms of really being usable. So we're introducing that split. We're not auditing all sites in our typology because it's just not pragmatic. We've slimmed it down to all our parks are functional amenity green spaces, and there is a definition behind what's functional and what's not, but essentially it's linked back to playability, as in it's usable for recreational purposes. Doesn't have to be the whole space, but needs to be a good chunk of the space, and also to do with slope, because we have quite a few sloping sites. A big chunk of Midlothian is built on the side of a hill, or our urban area, Midlothian kind of in a bowl. So we've got a lot of very sloped settlements. So we have to take that out, because obviously you can't really, and we were looking in all of that redefinition, we were looking on the fact that informal play spaces, because obviously we've got equipped play spaces, but we were looking around the informal, which is something our play strategy from 2017 does promote. And is something we're promoting through new development, but it's not something that was captured in the last audit. So sort of looking towards the potential of a place efficiency assessment, etc., we've kind of tried to grab that. We've included playing fields, and we've included our former bings, which is a bit of a quirky one, but it's a locally specific one in the location of those, because if we couldn't practically include all our woodland, we couldn't practically include all our natural and semi-natural green space, but former bings, due to their location and what they're actually being used for us, were a specific open space category that we wanted to audit, and largely they're in council ownership, which is important. So we've got some level of almost inconsistency between what we'll be doing our quantity assessment on, what we'll be doing our quality assessment on, and what we'll be doing our accessibility assessment on. So we will be doing all of those. With the criteria, our criteria were based on the green space quality criteria, I understand it. So that guide, having looked at them, there is a lot. I think that's what Ironside Farrer used. So we had 36 criteria, but we were finding that unmanageable. And also this time around doing it myself, I was finding there was a huge amount of overlap between the criteria. And I felt like sometimes I was judging the same thing twice. And that just there wasn't any purpose. So I've taken those and slimmed them down into 16 criteria at the moment, which I'm currently mapping across, because we'd almost finished our assessment for this time of the 0.4 hectares and above. So I have a load of scores for those. So I'm now having to map them across onto the new one. So that's taking some time. If only I was more proficient with spreadsheets, that might be quicker, but I'm no ninja with them. So it's a manual job. So yeah, so we're progressing steadily with that. We're progressing with our maps. One of the slight queries we have around our accessibility assessment is that we in the past used a straight line assessment, and I'm refusing to let that happen this time and demanding an actual walking distance, but we didn't have the GIS capability to achieve that. It's being looked into, partly because we're looking into it for our next LDP, and there's a bit of software they were looking at. I am so not proficient in GIS, so I rely on our GIS officer, who's only part-time and is currently off on 6 months plus sick leave. So we're working through that. So if anyone's got any answers on how you simply do an actual walking distance, that would be amazing, within a quite limited GIS capability. But we will get there. We will get there with that. Where we're heading with all of this is that we've got two functions to our strategy, and we have to put, which is why there's two of us involved in writing it. So we've got the planning side of it, which cares more about the audit outcome and where that's showing us where we're missing things, particularly in terms of quantity. And always the debate comes up with new housing release sites. What do they need to fulfill? And do they need to do it all on site? Is there a local excess that means that they can build more houses and put less open space on, etc., etc. So that's sort of where we're heading. We've got the planning side of it, but then we've also got one of the major outcomes of our strategy has to be about how the council is going to sort its own assets. So it will be very focused in on those essentially parks where change is needed, that the council can feasibly invest in. So my land and countryside services manager that's working with me on this, he's already been very clear that there are sites that may underperform in terms of the audit, but that doesn't mean we're going to commit to doing anything with them, even if they're in our ownership, because we don't have the resources and we never will. So we will have to prioritise our resources within the strategy, not necessarily directly saying this is going to cost X and when we're going to spend it, but kind of almost acknowledging that there are some sites that may only score in the 50s, but that's as good. We'll also have some debate. We have some debate around the potential, coming back to the conversation earlier around the potential of sites. And my colleague James spends quite a lot of time nagging me to say you have to look at what's there, not what it could be. And I was like, but I'm judging it against what it could be, as opposed to, so we're still figuring that out as we kind of go through. And that's an important thing when you're actually on site looking at it. It's like, are you looking at this in terms of it's a bit of grass, it's got one tree and it's got a path through it, perfectly functional. And I'm looking saying, well, could have some more planting, could have this, could be better. You know, there's space for it to be better. So we haven't quite bottomed that one out yet. So yeah, so that's it. And as I mentioned earlier, some of this will lead on. We're working on the side of this on planning guidance on open space design and standards and developer contributions, and place-based design, because we don't have anything in writing on that at the moment. And that's sort of a gap when it comes to the development management side. So although I'm policy, I'm very much trying to turn this into a tool that can be used for development management, because what they want to know when a developer comes forward with a proposal, particularly for housing, is how much open space is needed on site and how much is needed off site. particularly with the medium scale development. It's like we don't want a lot of little patches with 2 springy chickens in them. That's what we're trying to avoid. So yeah, it's quite complex, but we're getting there. We are making good progress, and these meetings have been really helpful.
Thank you very much, Emma. And I think you've just identified a measure of success is that we don't have lots of small sites with springy chickens in them, because we could almost travel the country with those. And, you know, in some areas, you know, over provision of very, you know, uninspiring equipped play areas, you know, where there's an over proliferation of them and they're not maintained and they're not used. So a couple of things for me before I open the floor, Emma. I think one of them is it'd be really helpful if you could share with us your 36 criteria slimmed down to 16. And I saw Ali nodding there, so I'm going to bring him in a minute around that one, because I think that element we were talking about trying to condense. Inside Farah worked with ourselves and Glasgow Clyde Valley when we did the quality guide, so they are certainly wedded to that type of approach on that. The other thing I just wanted to comment on was very much that element of it's really encouraging to see this being developed by planning colleagues and by the countryside, the land and countryside team, because so often we come to authorities and there's an open space strategy and that only sits within planning, and then there's a separate green space or park strategy, and there is no linkage between the two, you know. And I think when you are looking at this, there needs to be, and that element of current and future. You know, we can tell James he does need to look to the future as well. And there may be other routes rather than just the council investing in them. But yeah, so I've got a couple of hands up. I'll bring in Ivan first, and then Marguerite, and then Hajalinki.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to come back to this thing of the potential of sites and the extent to which that you're just collecting. Well, that's what's there now, and that's the quality of it now. And just, I guess, to remind people that the quality assessment is obviously just part of a sort of bigger jigsaw of strategies, and so that, you know, it goes towards thinking about it's evidence for the open space strategy. And for me, it's more for the role of the open space strategy to think in the context of a neighbourhood or a place. Well, what more do we need to do? And I mean, I know it's iterative, but if you go to a space, it's got potential for everything. So it totally depends on what your objectives are for that neighbourhood as to what potential there might be. So it might have potential for something, but it might not be a requirement in terms of, you know, there might already be loads of allotments or growing spaces in that particular neighbourhood. Mm-hmm. So I do sympathise with that idea as to, well, really the audit is what is there now and what's the current functions, and to what extent is it delivering the current functions. And then it's the process of debate about, well, what could it do in the context of needs? A quick thing on walking distances. I think Liz is here somewhere, isn't she? And I'm sure Liz said something about developing a database a national database that would allow that. But Julie's nodding, so Julie will come back on that one. But we did it back in the day. In fact, we may well have been the first to do it, because we did it with a partnership with the Hutton Institute. And the first step was for me to look at every single green space in Edinburgh and decide what the access point was. Mm-hmm. And so we literally mapped every single access point for every single green space in Edinburgh. And I mean, I can't see how you would do it without mapping the access points.
Oh no, yeah, we've worked out that much.
So you might have already done it. Yeah, okay, yeah. So you've already thought that through.
Yeah, I haven't done it yet. I put that delightful task off. But yes, I mean, we worked out.
You can do an awful lot through aerial photographs, obviously, but you know.
And we know Midlothian's quite small.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, it's certainly not impossible. In fact, I had a really enjoyable time doing a lot of it, but and you can do a lot by aerial as well. So I think that was probably it. Yeah, and the other thing just chuck in, just thinking about neighbourhoods and needs, was the whole idea of 20-minute neighbourhoods as well. So I think we really need to get thinking about, well, within a 10-minute walk of your house, what sorts of spaces should you be able to access? So should you be able to access perhaps a wilder space where you can experience contact with nature? Should you have a growing space within a 10-minute, or at least in theory, you might be on a waiting list, but at least in theory, a 10-minute walk from your house. So I think in terms of gaps, in terms of guidance, I think maybe that's perhaps where we could come in with thinking from that. Okay, you're doing quality of spaces, but what does quality mean in terms of a neighbourhood level, 10-minute walk type level, and that's probably a gap in terms of guidance.
It is. Also, the 20-minute neighbourhood, there's still quite a lot of work needed to translate that to suburbia. You know, it doesn't work that way. We're working on it in Midlothian, but our multiple small town structure doesn't work quite the same way that a city would in terms of that.
Interestingly, that driver, the Melbourne was one of the is one of the kind of beacon cities trying 20-minute neighbours out, and obviously Melbourne's really, really well known for having huge suburbs, and you know they found that many areas didn't have weren't by any means 20-minute neighbourhoods. So it's interesting that you're saying it doesn't work. Well, it does work. It just tells it does work. It just tells you that you've not got very good.
It's based on cities still. It does work and it will work, but from doing it on the ground, the narrative around 20-minute neighbourhoods is very city centric at the moment, and the circumstances for those of us that aren't a city are ever so slightly different, and it's just a case of watching the thinking as it develops and the policy as it comes out, because I know that thinking is happening, but it's just that at the moment it's not entirely, it can't be just dumped onto all of our urban structures, because our non-city urban structures, North Ayrshire will have this, Perth and Kinross will have this, just don't work that way. Perth and Kinross is quite different to Midlothian, but we have to look at things like, we have one allotment in Midlothian in Pennycook. We don't have any others. We haven't actually ever tripped over the need for demand for it. We're working on a future strategy. We have it written into our LDP about future ones, but certain things, it just doesn't. So I know that the pragmatic side of that is going to come out. So I'm not questioning the 20-minute neighbourhood, because I think it's a wonderful concept, but there is just a reality is it's come out of cities, and therefore there is some adapting still to be done when it's applied to the whole of the Scottish urban structure. That's all.
Before I bring the next person on, I'll just pick up that element around the network analysis. And Liz has stepped off the meeting bus briefly, but hopefully when she rejoins the bus, she's been doing work on a data portal, focusing at the moment particularly on the publicly accessible green space that features on the Ordnance Survey Open Green Space data set, which does have access points mapped already by Ordnance Survey on that. And she's doing network analysis. That data could be provided to local authorities. And again, I think that's something we could start to be talking about as part of the Scotland Green Space Map Working Group. Colleagues in Geosite within Scottish Government have developed methodologies in relation to network mapping as well. And I'm thinking of the planning portal that's there. So some of the things around quality may have to be done locally, but some of that things around accessibility, it's largely just a data processing and power for crunching the whole thing, says a non-technical person talking about it. But I just know you set the machines up and they run for a long time thinking about it, and then it churns out an answer. So actually there may be some things where there's efficiencies to actually Scottish Government or others providing that data. So I saw Kristin nodding at that point. So that might be something we can take back.
Yeah, definitely. We're starting to have conversations with our colleagues in e-planning around what kind of things like Julie's just outlined that we could kind of help support authorities to do some of this. Yeah.
Because we really do know that some authorities are really struggling in terms of the GIS capability on that one. Okay, Ivan's waving now. He's got a pretend hand and a real hand, so I'll let you come back in, Ivan.
Just a sort of a bit of a warning that, you know, like with any model or whatever, it's well, there's a vulgar way of putting it, but it depends on what data you put in. And if you get one access point wrong, it can make a huge difference to the accessibility of a green space. So you can't necessarily just believe what the national database tells you about gateways or whatever.
So I'm going to just bring Ali in briefly, because I'm sure he pressed his button there. I know Ali's had a lot of experience at doing the network analysis, so I'll bring Ali in just to talk about that bit for a moment.
Yeah, I mean, I've done a lot of this stuff. I'm kind of lucky that I have access to GIS and can use it a wee bit. But yeah, I mean, as Ivan says, I think doing this at a national level might give you some kind of broad flavour. And I think, the access points associated with the green space map that's available is only a partial, it's a subset of all the access points a local authority is likely to have. And there's all the question around open-sided access points, particularly for, or open-sided green spaces, particularly residential spaces where you just step off the pavement that won't be recognised in that. So I think it might give you a very broad brush feel for a particular kind of space. But I think if we're going down to the level of, these audits and strategies really reflecting local sets of circumstances, then it won't really be fit for that particular purpose.
Just to say on that, I know Ordnance Survey and Dom from there will always make the play that if you have got more information on your particular access points, they have this tool called TalOS, and they're very keen to get that local data as well.
Yeah.
Okay, Liz, when you briefly stepped off the meeting bus, your ears may have been burning. We were just talking about the data portal that you've been working on that proof of concept, because we were having a conversation just now around the moving away from quality but looking at accessibility and the opportunities to support local authorities through that. So we've touched on what might happen through the e-planning portal. Now that you've just joined us, I just wanted to know, is there anything you wanted to come in and say around that before I bring other colleagues back into the conversation?
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, nothing right now. I'm driving at the minute.
We will let you concentrate on driving.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I've now got a list of hands and I'm kind of working it. I think I was coming to Marguerite next.
Thanks, Julie. I won't be long. So, Emma, I just had a couple of points I was interested in. I think particularly because of the way you've approached the task overall, and you talked about the play strategy. When you look at the portfolio that you've got across the whole of Midlothian, do you start off by thinking that you want to see things within that? So you're not just looking at what you've actually got and reaching its full potential, but you're looking to say, well, do we actually have any fully inclusive sites for play? So that you start to build a picture of what you would like to see there, as well as what actually is there. And I think the second point I was really interested in was your playability comments, and I wondered what you were using to assess that. What is it that you're looking there? Is there kind of top 3 things that you're maybe looking at in playability?
Okay, first off, we have our play strategy, which, as I say, I think it's 2017. We weren't involved in that, but that talks about various things like that. And I know there have been a lot of discussions about inclusive play in council-owned play spaces. And one of the things that I'm going to get into the design standards for our new play areas is around accessibility and inclusive play. Acknowledging that not every piece of equipment needs to be accessible, but all play spaces do need to be accessible. We also talk in the draft about the fact that parents and carers are sometimes the ones with accessibility issues, not just the young people. So thinking about how close, for example, I have a friend who uses a Motability scooter, and how close she can get to the play equipment that her children are quite happy using, but they want her involved. She doesn't want to have to sit 20, 30 yards away shouting to them. She wants to be able to go and engage in the same way that I would. In terms of the playability of a site, the assessment, I haven't managed to capture any criteria yet. I'm using the fact I have a 10-year-old and a 6-year-old, and I have spent an inordinate amount of time in play spaces in the last 10 years. I have started trying to capture some sort of criteria, and I did have a look at it, but I think I'm going to have to wait until Kwan's work comes out, because I just didn't manage to get to a point where I could narrow it down enough into criteria, workable criteria as to this space is playable. One of the main things we use is safe. So distance to road and or boundary treatments is that. We're still debating what exactly, because we've never quantified, we've never captured exactly what we mean. Obviously, traditionally fencing was used, but hedging can be used. And we were having a discussion recently about mounding and how high, because you don't want to cut visibility. It's quirky things. When you get down into the details, it's like you think, oh, mounding's fantastic. And I've been to play parks where my kids love the mounding around the edge. But in terms of a safety thing, you need it low enough so that parents can see into it, so that you don't create a visual barrier and therefore antisocial behavior to do with that. But you need it high enough that it actually discourages or slows down a wayward toddler. So yeah, we haven't really got, so I'm really keeping an eye out. But I have been through, and I went through Play England's stuff, and I found that quite useful, but I haven't actually managed to stop and get myself down to a list of criteria yet on what we would expect to be present for something to be classified as an informal play space. And one of the conversations we've been having is around, with the informal play spaces, if we're going to measure it as a quantity thing, we need to be able to define where it is. So the whole of for example, a park, the whole of it may not be playable, or it might be, or yeah. So, you know, the whole of a green space may not be playable if you apply criteria to it in terms of being able to measure it as an informal play space. And I haven't got my head around that yet, to tell you the truth.
No, I just wondered if you'd worked out the answer, because we'd love to know it.
No, but I'd love to work with you on working out the answer. So yeah, as I say,
that's fine.
Using experience as a parent.
Right. Okay, thanks.
No, I think that's really helpful. And I know Marguerite, Cherie, Kwan and Jenny are talking later this week again around that, and particularly around, you know, engaging children, young people, parents and carers within this, because it is one element where, you know, there does need to be that assessment from users, rather than just saying, okay, if it's got these features, these criteria, tick box. So, okay, right. Kwan, I'm going to alter my order to bring Kwan in, because I think that's probably relevant to the conversation we were just having there. So I'll bring Kwan in, and then Ali, and then Hanika.
Thank you so much. Emma, I was listening to your presentation, and there are lots of interesting points, but I think this last bit of discussion with Margaret brought in, it's something that I'm really quite interested in. You're waiting for me to come up with something, but I'm looking at you to sort of say that we can work together here, because you are already on that journey. And I'm particularly interested because you were also mentioning about your work with your planning colleague and looking at design guidance, because in some ways those design guidance, design thinking could also inform us about the assessment criteria. Because some of the things that I am battling in my head is we're going to ask people to talk about quantity, but what do we mean by quantity? I mean, in terms of open space, there's probably quite established working kind of things that we can refer to, but in terms of play, I mean, what are we talking about? And especially if you already start looking at some of these criteria and quantity, it would be very good to share that and to have a discussion and conversation about it, because there's so many things you can come in to talk about the design, but then we're also not wanting to be very prescriptive about how you design a space, because there's a creativity about it. But actually, if we are able to distill it down to some of the key indicators, then that will help us in going forward in terms of what do we mean by sufficiency. When we were talking there, Kristen sort of said to me whether I want to share a bit of slides. So Julie, I'm going to ask your permission. Is it okay if I bring in?
Go ahead.
Quick slide, if I can find it here. It's really me trying to make sense of, can you see that now?
Yep, that's fine. Yeah. And I know that Emma's going to have to jump off the bus in a few minutes.
Okay. So this is us talking about quality. And to me, in terms of PSA, what we're thinking is that local authority or planning authority are able to demonstrate the fitness of purpose in terms of meeting enjoyment, social and developmental needs of children, as well as the space itself contributes to the overall quality of the place. So there's a mouthful, there's a lot of it in that kind of a few words. And then you start looking, I'm starting to develop potential indicators at the locality or neighborhood level as to how we see some of the features and criteria, such as looking at trees and greeneries and natural materials and all those sort of things that contribute to good quality play space, looking at safety, suitable surfaces, looking at traffic noises and pollution. And then you have to also look at all that of a single space, but then look at all that across the neighborhood and see what percentage of those spaces are sort of already exists, and how do we improve that in terms of what do we mean by sufficiency. So it's a development of thinking at the moment as to the next stage, but a lot more conversation, please, about sharing experience and knowledge would be really helpful. Does that kind of helpful in terms of, shall I unshare it now?
Yeah, no, that's good to see.
And I think that's really helpful, Kwan, because I think what that really does illustrate is the importance of looking at the open space quality assessment and the place efficiency assessment in tandem, rather than as two separate processes when we're looking in terms of that efficiency. I have to say I was also just prompted while Emma was talking around the issue of affordances, and that Mid Lothian may excel in terms of grass slopes for rolling down if your slopes are maybe not too high. But when you were thinking of talking about these steeply sided slopes, I seem to remember that was one of my favourite things to do. I lived in a very flat area, so I used to get very excited about hills and rolling down grass slopes. But anyway, that was a frivolous diversion. I'm going to bring Ali in, who's been waiting patiently, and then when we get to about past, I'm going to ask if we want a 5-minute break at that point. So Ali, can I bring you in?
Thank you. Or going down in a sledge, Julie. Thanks. Gosh, Catherine, I'm back to why I put my hand up in the first place. I think it was about accessibility, and I think the original conversation had been about access in and out of parks or open spaces, and I suppose I wanted to flag up, and it did then move on to talk about inclusion, that accessibility means different things to different people, and so it's not just about how you get in and out of a space, it's also about the quality of that space for that particular need, which I think is a different thing. But there are other types of accessibility as well, and one of them is financial. So it might be, if it's a flagship park, costs associated with actually travelling to or from that space. But actually during the summer, a lot of our spaces become filled up with vans selling food, selling sweets for children, rides, I have to say, in the middle of parks, which is a particular horror of mine. But anyway, all of these things have money attached, and therefore that might make going to that place just a bit less accessible for certain families, because they just can't afford the money that they would need to pay out. And if there's a lot of pressure from children because everybody else's mum and dad are paying for that to happen, then so I think there is also financial accessibility, and the other part of it is the cognitive accessibility part, that whether or not you think that somewhere is for you. Now, I think that probably links a bit with things like the criteria around whether or not people use the space. But we all know that we can have beautiful parks on our doorstep, but some areas within the population or within that community will not go there, and it might be because they don't feel safe, which is another part of accessibility, or it might be because they don't see a lot of other people like themselves, or because it doesn't feel like it's something culturally that would be normal for them. So I think when you're talking about accessibility, it's just really important that it's not just about physical access and inclusion, it's also about financial access and cognitive access.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really valid point, that, Ali, particularly around that inclusion element and that cognitive element. I'm thinking as well of, very early days went out in some green spaces and marker signs for gangs, which meant that certain children couldn't use those areas. And also that kind of well-known study around Pollock Park, where people living locally, that's not for us, that's for the people going to Pollock House and the Burrell, so yes, access on the doorstep, but
it's also because it's got huge roads running all round it, so you can't actually get across the road to get into it. That's another issue in Pollock Park there.
Yeah. Hadanenka, you've been waiting patiently there as well. Can I bring you in? you're on mute. You've got the yellow card. The first time we've had to say you're on mute today.
Sorry. Oh no, I ruined it all. Yeah, I was just going to react to Emma's comment about this. Are we measuring, existing condition or potential improvements? And that's been a difficulty for us as well. And we really went for scoring against the sort of the best self of that green space because we didn't know what else to go for without sort of identifying really strict criteria for all the different typologies. But I think partly the worry is this nervousness from our green space team that if a space scores badly, it reflects on their work, and that if people just see a score, say a low score next to one of our big parks, they immediately think, oh, because it's not well maintained or the grass is not cut. And I think we are trying to think about how we could market this in a more positive way. So even if you don't call it, for example, quality score, but you call it opportunity score, to show that what we're talking about is how much opportunity there is within this green space to become better. Because that is eventually how we're going to use this. So I think from our perspective, we know we're not going to get a budget to work through our worst green spaces. It's more about when there's a planning application, can we get something to the nearby park to improve it? Or when we're looking for a food growing site, can we pick one where we think actually, this doesn't score well on diversity and this is in the neighborhood, maybe that's what we want to do with it. So let me know if you come to a conclusion on that, because that could be useful for us as well. But that's been our thinking.
Just to come back on that one, that element about low scores not necessarily leading to budgets. Edinburgh, different financial times, but when they started going down using green flags strategically, instead of presenting how amazing we've achieved green flags for these sites, they actually benchmarked against and were able to demonstrate that they had a large proportion of parks failing to meet the minimum standard, and that was actually quite a powerful tool then for securing investment. So sometimes from an advocacy approach, that can be helpful as well. I'm going to bring Ivan in, and then I'm going to see if we want to break before we hear from Ali and Tom. So Ivan?
Yeah, just sort of agreeing the heck out of Ali in terms of this, the sort of cognitive barriers, and just a bit of experience myself. I live very near Stockton Park. My son doesn't go there though, because last time he did, he got punched in the face because it basically wasn't his 14. It wasn't his territory, if you like. So he just sticks to Roseburn Park now. I think that's very difficult for a green space officer to deal with, frankly, in terms of solutions. I think it's a wider issue. But I just wanted to also just, and I'm not sure this will help either in a sense, but it struck me in terms of Quan's, that the talk about design and the different design elements, whether it's a slope or a fence or a hedge. And there was kind of 8 data points and 8 things to measure in design terms as to whether something was added up. So it was quite a sort of reductionist approach. Equally, you could just go and ask people if they feel safe or if they feel that the children are safe. So that's the kind of place standard direction that the place standard goes at something with. And you can't do both. It's just too much. Somehow we've got to find something in between, or something that uses the best of both, that enables local authorities to do this stuff efficiently. And I don't know what the answer is, but maybe we just look for the best example of a customer survey that has done that along the lines of, is it playable, is it safe, are your kids safe, and so on, and just exemplify it and leave for local authorities to decide what to use.
I can see lots of hands up, but I'm not going to bring everyone in, or we won't get our little break. But I will just say, so many people these days have smartphones, and we're familiar with things popping up going, Google, do you want to rate where you've been? So actually, there might be options now for us to get some of those user ratings and to start understanding, because what you really want to know is what did you want to do in the space today, and how well did it meet those needs? And so actually, there may be ways of doing that. And again, that's something around that e-planning portal and others that we might be able to come and pick up. So it's just gone 1:30. I'm going to sorry, 1:30, 3:30 even. I was going to suggest if we take a 5-minute sort of comfort and stretch break, have a cup of tea. And I know, Emma, is it?
It's 1:45.
It's 1:45. You need to.
I should be back on about 4.
Okie dokie. So if we can do that, and then when we come back after the break, I was going to ask Ali C to just talk us through experience around quality across the Glasgow and Clyde Valley areas, and then I'll put Tom on the spot as well, although I know he's kind of just getting into this element, and then we'll pick up any sort of discussions after that, so we've had a chance to hear from them too as well, if that's okay, folks. So I'm looking at my time, if we can synchronise watches, and if we can be back here at 15:37. Thanks. You don't physically need to leave, but just if you want to turn your camera off, or if you need to nip to get a cuppa, that's fine. It's always good to see other people switch their cameras back on, and you know that you're not the only one who's actually come back.
Well, we haven't stood you up yet, Julie.
And that's my cup of tea just arriving as well. You said failed on that one. Thanks. I think
Just wonder why my mailbox was full when I emptied it the other day, and it's Kristen.
Yeah, I was going to say, Kristen, one thing would be useful is save as a PDF. And then it does make a PowerPoint an awful lot smaller. But yes, but it has notes on it, and that's one thing I've not found a way yet of doing that, where you can save a PowerPoint as a PDF and keep the notes if you've actually put notes on, because it's quite helpful having those thoughts from Kristin on that. So yes, Kristin did apologise for filling up your inboxes with that PowerPoint. So
it's good to have it, actually.
Yeah, good. Okay. I think I said kind of quite wildly at the beginning, we probably won't need until 4:30. And I'd forgotten how much we can all talk and how much there is to discuss around this. So thank you anyway very much for all those contributions. I'm going to ask Ali just to talk us through his experience of quality. So Ali kind of has the is the element of being partly responsible for shaping what the quality guide was, and then actually having to deliver it in practice and finding out that that's quite a lot of criteria. How do we actually make this workable? So that was kind of summarising what I think Ali might be going to tell us. So Ali C, if I can hand over to you, just tell us a little bit about your experience with Glasgow Clyde Valley.
Yeah, no, thanks, Joe. I mean, I think my experience has started before that, when I was a green space officer with Eastern Barnshire Council, and that was the first audit and strategy that I was involved in. But I think I will restrict myself to the practicalities of working with criteria rather than some of the more philosophical debates around what we want all this to do. And you're right, I was heavily involved in shaping that document that we both produced collectively back whenever it was. And someone mentioned earlier, I think it was Emma, there would be this unwieldy suite of criteria that was in that, and it was a kind of, and I guess, almost immediately after producing that, going out and trying to use it in anger, I realised that there was a lot of repetition in there. And also it was a kind of mixed bag of stuff. There was some hard stuff that just looked at the quality of infrastructure, which is, one thing. And then there was other things that were trying to introduce an element of a value judgment, about, what local people thought of that. And of course, you can do one thing when you're out on site, but you can't do the other thing when you're out on site as an officer. So, that thing belongs somewhere else as part of the consultation process. So very quickly realised that this was, pretty an unwieldy suite of things to use. So shortly after that, we started working with other authorities, in particular Glasgow. And we, as Emma had suggested, or someone else suggested, we reduced that suite of criteria right down from, I can't remember, it was near enough 40, I think, or something, right down to 15 or 16. But kept the essence of the broad areas that we're looking at: accessibility, biodiversity, the management, how welcoming and safe a place. So it was broadly structured around 5 areas that you would want to know, how a space functioned. And we worked on those with Glasgow at the time, and then we started applying those. And and again, you soon realise that a suite of 16 criteria trying to assess a very formal Victorian park versus a very kind of low, light touch nature reserve. These things it's very difficult for these criteria to assess all things. So what happens is you come out with, it works well for the Victorian park because that's in essence what it was designed to do. And then when you go to do a natural space, it's scoring like 30% or something like that, and of course that space isn't rubbish. It's it does what it's supposed to do. So then you're left with 2 options. You either reduce the quality threshold of what's acceptable for the natural spaces when you're assessing those, or you come up with a slightly different set of criteria that overlap with the other ones but are more tailored towards the particular space that you're looking at. And in Glasgow, that's the route we went down. And so there was still the essence of accessibility and biodiversity and all that, but they were tweaked specifically for the particular space. And this blossomed, I suppose, and evolved into, had a suite of 4 different types. Yeah. So there was one for Victorian, formal parks, if you like. And there was one for residential amenity, which was, has similarities, but is often less formal. And then we had one for natural spaces. And, again, there's that again, that can cover a huge range of things, from formal country parks that have car parks and cafes and visitor centres, right through to your local space that you just maybe has a couple of windus paths and not a lot else. And then the third one, the last one that we developed was to do with playing fields, and it was more to reflect the fact, not the kind of how many people played football on a Sunday and how great a game they had. It wasn't really that kind of aspect of playing fields. It was how playing fields delivered almost like that kind of amenity value for people. A lot of them are open. People will probably walk their dogs on them, and kids play on them a lot more than they actually ever use for football or rugby or whatever it happens to be. So we developed a fourth related but separate suite of criteria for those. And I guess, we've applied those with Glasgow. Glasgow have since reworked those again. We then worked with Eastern Bartonshire and subsequently, or currently, with South Lanarkshire. And every time there's a slight tweak, and we can improve on things. And if I had my time again, I would fiddle with them endlessly. And I think, as Ivan said earlier, you could go on like this forever and not get to the right answer. There isn't a right answer, because you're trying to assess so many different things in so many unique situations that it's impossible. There isn't a right answer, so you just have to come up with the best you can. But I think, iteratively, we're kind of slowly getting there. But you're still left with this conundrum. Are you assessing as an officer, are you assessing the hard quality of what you see when you're out there in terms of the diversity of infrastructure and the quality of that infrastructure? Or are you trying to make some judgment on how good it is for local people? And of course, you can't do that as an officer. You need to ask local people if it's meeting their needs and aspirations. And this is where, I guess this is where we've talked about the resource implication of simply doing an audit, and particularly if we're working with South Lanarkshire just now, near upwards of 400 and odd spaces that they're having to visit and qualitatively assess, so it's no mean task. But with them as well, we've started dipping our toe in how we might do consultation on the quality of spaces as well. And there's a very kind of active community in Carluke who have a group set up specifically to look at accessing green space. So we had a kind of Zoom consultation with them a couple of weeks ago. And again, it's just to emphasise this resource implication. The resource in terms of setting that meeting up and providing materials that then could be used interactively, and then running the meeting and getting all the you think you try to set the meetings up within parameters, but with community groups, inevitably spills out into all sorts of different directions you weren't quite expecting. So to then take all that information and document it and respond to it, and that was only with one relatively small community in Carluke, and if you replicate that across a massive area like South Lanarkshire or in Glasgow or somewhere else, then you can see it starts to become very unwieldy. And that felt like a kind of meaningful consultation, but it was just to make the point that if that's the kind of meaningful consultation you envisage for this, then the implication for the resources are just mental. So that's a very quick canter, I guess, through 20 years. And I haven't arrived at a right answer, and I'm not sure we ever will, but I think we're getting close. But you do need to allow that flexibility for local, a reflection of local circumstances. We can't just come up with a set of criteria and say, here's what you need to use.
Thanks very much for that, Ali. Can I just leap in with one question first? It strikes me that we're almost trying to drill down to get this kind of capsule wardrobe of quality indicators here. And you talked about 15, 16. Emma talked about that. So I think one thing is an immediate question is about whether you can share those sort of condensed criteria that you've got to. But the other one is thinking where we came in with Kristin's presentation and recognising that the policy landscape has moved on since we did that quality guide, and particularly around, climate resilience, climate positive green spaces, particularly thinking as well about health and well-being, where I think our focus then was very much on infrastructure around physical activity rather than some of the sort of mental health and well-being elements. Are there criteria that you've been using now that actually, if you step back a bit, you thought we're missing something here? Is there something in your little wardrobe that's not that we're not covering where
I mean,
there is a gap?
you know, the ones we're using most recently in South Lanarkshire don't take account of the ability of a space for climate change adaptation, for instance, and the reason it doesn't do that is because we're building on an audit that started in 2015 and adding new sites. So we wanted to keep consistency, but I think if I was moving on to work with another authority now, then we'd need to think about how we factored in climate change adaptation, some kind of aspects of, you know, or a more robust way of thinking about how health and play were included in those. And I should have said as well, we do have a set of criteria for play and for muggers as well, and we come up with this kind of. But we only assessed those where they were part of a wider space, and then we come up with this kind of cumbersome way of integrating the scores together that meant that the play score weighted the overall score of the space. So we tried to integrate that, but there must be a much slicker. Well, there is a much slicker way of doing that. We just haven't done it yet. But you're absolutely right. I think that suite of 16 criteria, when we move on to the next local authority, we need to review those. And I think. I don't think we can throw out any of those groupings of 5 criteria around accessibility, biodiversity, and whatever else they are. It would need to be another set of 3 or 4 criteria that's bolted on that looks at, you know, climate change or more specifically at health.
And just one last question, which is again about those gaps, is a little bit of future scanning, a bit of horizon scanning, you know, because now I kind of kick myself thinking, how did we not think about climate change when we were doing the quality guide? So I think if we're looking ahead in terms of the policy landscape, this is a question I think for all of us to just think about. Are there things that we see coming over the horizon that we ought to be including as well?
I mean, I think our criteria, that we have 3. Historically, we've used 3 criteria in the biodiversity thing, and this one's about, you know, what is the diversity of species, and for nesting and feeding and all that kind of stuff. What are the range of habitats? You know, so moving on from one's about structural diversity of vegetation and stuff, and one's about the diversity of habitats, and then one's about how it contributes to a network in the local kind of area. And if we're talking about an response to an ecological emergency, then we need to think a bit more broadly than just those kind of broad criteria that don't really fit the bill. I guess we're trying to think more about what potentially, because that's one thing that most species could do that very few people would argue with, it. They could be more biodiverse. So perhaps we need to think more about what those criteria are.
That's helpful, and I'm hearing that sort of phrase ecosystem services kind of coming through there, but I'm not going to go there at that point. But I'm going to have to learn how to pronounce your name. I can't just keep calling you H through all of this, so apologies. Can I bring you in, Hadnika?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, Ali, that made me feel so much better what you've just said, because I totally feel this this conundrum of what are we focusing on? Are we trying to really understand our green spaces and neighborhoods, or are we trying to create a study which can be compared with other authorities on a national level? And I guess I've been a bit worried about what comes out in legislation and guidance, because I think we would prefer to do the first. So if we're talking about doing our quality audits in clusters, that's going to take ages. But if we commit to it, that also means that our officers are doing the work. We are actually getting to know our neighborhoods. We can jump in when there's an opportunity because we're all sort of working towards it. Whereas if we try to do just, you know, a really strict approach with like comparable scoring and not really adapted, then there's the danger that it just sort of, we lose that real meaning behind it. And I think that happened to a couple of authorities beforehand. So yeah, it's not an easy task. And with regards to the climate change criteria, I was going to mention we've been part of the Park Power research project. So something that I was going to add to these criteria is there space within green spaces to do something in relation to climate change mitigation, whether that's to, for example, include renewable energy generation or things like SADs, or for example, a housing development next to a park, could they use it to treat rainwater? Could they use it to generate energy or place a, I don't know, some kind of biomass plant? So that that was going to be added to ours, and it would be quite good to look at, because again, that's about the opportunity of what could happen to that space.
Yeah, that's great. And I think again that part power and the green heat and green space identifies things where we can actually do sort of data and analysis at a national level that we can then serve to support local authorities rather than everybody having to do things individually. So I think there is something around things that can only be done locally, things that can only be done with communities and users, and things that could actually be done more efficiently at a national level to provide data to support. Okay, Ivan, can I bring you in?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it was really good to hear Alistair say that, you know, looking back, they might have done more on the opportunities, you know, for more natural habitats. I think that's something probably Sue and I maybe go away and think about a bit more in terms of, you know, the new approaches to, you know, things like more relaxed mowing regimes and so on, and what are the sort of obvious things that authorities can adopt. But there might, I think there is a piece of work there to fill the gaps in that aspect, and we'll look again at that guidance and what that says. And there's obviously kind of new approaches to delivering both, so delivering the climate resilience and using a park for, you know, for drainage, but also for new wetland habitats and so on and so forth. There's good examples of that from London and so on, retrofit of parks that deliver on a whole bunch of objectives. But I was coming back to this thing of the sort of number of data points. And I think there's sort of two suggestions. One is that it's about priorities. So again, coming back to what's the needs of a neighbourhood, and therefore what does your assessments need to particularly focus on? But it's also just thinking about, well, could you see an approach whereby, yeah, inevitably there will be gaps, because it will be just what your resources can deliver in terms of the number of things you assess. So is there a way of just presenting it and saying, well, we've got a high degree of confidence in this aspect of the green space because we've done this survey, or we've got a high degree of confidence in this particular bit of our local authority because we've done this work, and there's a bit less confidence in this area or this theme. You know, I guess in the same way that thinking about something like the UK ecosystems health assessment, it's about that thick. And there's some things we can say about certain species with a high level of confidence, or certain ecosystems, and there's less we can say about others because the data just isn't there. So wonder whether there's something there that means that we're not insisting on this mythical comprehensive data set.
Ali C, do you want to come back in on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just to raise a point that, you know, when if we're talking about aspects of climate change adaptation or mitigation, then some of that could fit within a criteria that you assess as part of quality. Other it will be more to do with strategic opportunities mapping, you know, so it doesn't really fit rightly within this, because so the things you might assess for quality are, you know, can you increase tree canopy cover to intercept water and reduce, you know, surface water flooding, reduce temperatures, you know, regulate temperatures locally, that kind of thing. But if you're talking about, you know, heat sources and energy, then that's much more of a strategic mapping kind of thing that's done at, you know, either a local authority or a regional level, and doesn't really rightly belong in a quality assessment.
Yep. A few nods there. Your hand's up again, Ivan. Are you wanting to come back in, or is that from last time? No. Okay.
Just agreeing with Ali.
Yeah. Okay. Right. I'm going to turn now to Tom, if I can, just to let us know where you're at in terms of your stage of thinking about how you're approaching your quality. Assessment.
Firstly, I want to say thanks for the discussion, because that's gave me so much food for thought, and you'll find out why when I tell you where we're at with our quality assessment. So in North Ayrshire, we have an open space strategy. It'll be in place until 2025, 2026. So at the very early stages we're at now is trying to update the audit, which was undertaken in 2013, and that was done by Ironside Farrar, and it had the same 30-40 odd criteria that we were talking about. We decided again this time round, well, firstly a little bit about our work as in North Ayrshire. That was carried out by Street Scene, or the the Parks Department, that they would be it'd be their responsibility to maintain the spaces, without much input from planning, to be honest. And those that did that work have now since left the council or in different jobs. So trying to find that data and what happened and what informed the strategy was really difficult. So the first thing we did was set up a steering group with Street Scene to make sure that that didn't happen again. So that has planning officers on it and members of the estates team and the Street Scene team. And we decided to go out and procure again for the audit, and Ironside Ferrar won that contract. So they're currently doing that now, and one of the biggest challenges we have just now is trying to figure out where the actual spaces are and how many there are and how many should we include in the audit. Thinking back to what the things that Emma was saying earlier on about leaving some sites out of the audit, I'd be quite keen to figure out what criteria she used to not include some sites in the audit, because that's kind of where we're at the moment. But in terms of quality, yeah, it's being able to figure out how to cut back on that criteria so it's more manageable would be really useful, actually, and would probably put us in a better stead moving forward to try and do some more work ourselves as opposed to going out to tender again for the work. So yeah, thank you for all your discussion on that, and that is where we're at the moment. It's just we're hoping to get a finalised audit by the summer from Ironside Ferrar on that. And then one of the things we're also keen on thinking about quality and moving towards place efficiency assessment is trying to think about it in terms of a settlement overview or a locality overview, and thinking about clusters that we spoke about earlier, and moving forward then into place efficiency assessments, and maybe trying to hang a bit more analysis on it to have a bit more an idea of what's actually happening on the ground, and also bringing in our community planning partnership at that stage as well to put in a wee bit more engagement in there. They're currently quite proactive, talking to communities about what's special at their places, what their priorities are, which is more wide-ranging than play areas. But I think that might be the way to try and tackle some of the resourcing problems, is to hook it onto other consultations or other pieces of work that the council are doing, and maybe trying to have a piece of work that works across the council as opposed to trying to work in silos, which is what happened way back in 2016 or a few years before that.
Yep, no, that's really helpful, Tom, and that element around avoiding those silos, because there are so many strategies where consultant commissioned, job done, we have a strategy, but it sits on a shelf and doesn't necessarily do a significant amount. I'd just be interested to know, given that Ironside Ferrar were involved in developing the original sort of green space quality guide, have they come up with anything? Have they been self-critical in terms of the way that Ali has kind of done the lived experience of going, that sounded good on paper, but actually we're now going to try to rationalize those criteria down? Have they done any of that rationalizing themselves in terms of what they're offering you?
No, not at the moment, but that's not to say that won't happen. I asked them at the outset, because I made them aware that I was having these discussions with yourself and Kirsten. I was on the workshop that happened last year, so it might be up for change. And they said, yes, absolutely, we'd be up for being part of that discussion. So they know that kind of thing's coming, but we haven't reached that stage of the project yet. We're really thinking about where the spaces are and what data sets to use and things like that first.
You're on mute, Julie.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I've got the red card. I'll definitely fail on that one. Yes, so Emma, we saw you briefly in your car, and I'm just hoping that you're not on video and driving at the same time, but your hand's up. Did you want to come in and speak at this point?
It's all right. I'm safely parked now. So we're fine. Engine is off. Can you actually hear me?
Yep, that's fine.
Okay, great. So yeah, in terms of your question, Tom, about how we narrowed it down, I think it came down to pragmatism, and I worked with my colleague. We started off with ruling out woodland, because obviously assessing woodland as an open space is incredibly complex, and neither of us have the expertise to assess woodland. And it kind of went from there, and then we ruled out natural and semi-natural green space, largely because yeah, it was an easy category to lop out, and we needed to lop something out. So I think we came at it from a what wasn't going to fit well under the criteria that we were using, what wasn't really very meaningful in terms of the results, and also coming at, I suppose, from both actors, what was the least meaningful and what was the most meaningful. So our parks, in terms of a quality assessment, that's really where we're going to create something meaningful out of that assessment. Our functional open spaces is somewhere where we're going to create something meaningful. Our former bings, I mentioned them earlier, they're a bit of an oddity we've got in, but that's because they are meaningful. Although they're natural and semi-natural, they're actually quite meaningful spaces, and also we own and control them. That was another reason why we left out woodland, is because we own some of them, but we've got a lot of urban woodland, but we actually don't own big chunks of it. So yeah, it was a very pragmatic, we needed to slim it down, and then yeah, we kind of came at it from both directions. And then yeah, sometimes we assessed sites and later figured out that category, it was easier just to take it out.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, there's always a degree of pragmatism, but as you were speaking there, I was hearing colleagues in Edinburgh who are working on their green and blue network planning at the moment, and some of those natural sites are absolutely key for that. But whether it's the same quality assessment they're doing. Ali,
they are. Interestingly, I've already done our green network supplementary guidance and our strategy. So in terms of the green network, those sites are vital. So I've essentially got a hierarchy that starts at the very top with all green infrastructure, because obviously green infrastructure is your biggest category, because there are things that aren't spaces but are green infrastructure. So you've got your green infrastructure. You've then got your green network, which is all the connected spaces and green features that are connected. It includes the routes as well. You've then got your green spaces, which are the spaces within the green network that are actually spaces, because not all of your green network is a space in that kind of Fraser McNaughton at Nature Scotland, you always used to sort of the blob and the join. So you're kind of thinking of more of the spaces rather than the linear spaces. And then we've got our open spaces, which are almost a subset of all green spaces. We're not including golf courses. They are in terms of our green spaces, and we're going to have we have an overarching policy and approach which protects those. But when it comes down to what the open space strategy is going to look at, what the open space policy and our LDP is going to look at, and what we're actually asking for from developers in terms of new open space, it sits even below the sort of total green space picture. So I've ended up with that hierarchy, which was the only way I could sort it out in my head, because we had all these overlapping things, but I benefited from having done the green network stuff first.
That was interesting, Emma, and there was some little smiles there from Kristin and Kwan, because last week we were talking about definitions of green infrastructure, green networks and green space to go through to legal. So it was quite interesting hearing your very clear hierarchy there. So Ali, can I bring you in? Your hand popped up around the natural space area, I think it was.
Well, it was a bit of that, and just a bit about, Tom had asked the question about, what's in and what's out. And I think, most recently, again, working with South Lanarkshire, if you can envisage somewhere like East Kilbride, then, it becomes a bit of a nightmare, really, when you're trying to think about what's in and what's out. But really, we did divide. I mean, and East Kilbride has just, incredible amounts of what you would call residential amenity space, and we had to separate that out into, well, some of it really is actually transport amenity. It's just stuff along the side of all the roads that go through East Kilbride. So that's one category. And then you had to subdivide what was left into usable, what we call, you same term, use functional residential amenity, or the other term we used was structural residential amenity. And the structural residential amenity didn't get qualitatively assessed. And there was no hard and fast criteria, Tom, but what it really was to do was to do the configuration of that space, like you were just saying, Emma. Is it long and thin? Is it 100, maybe 100 yards long, but it's only 2 meters wide. You can't do much with it. So on a slope, or it's just the composition. It's just it's wall-to-wall trees with no path through it. So all of those kind of things, together, there was this whole lump, a couple of hundred sites. It just meant, right, okay, they add to the feel of the area. But in terms of being functional green spaces, they're not. They'll provide wildlife benefit, but we're not going to qualitatively assess that. And that was the only way that we could make it a manageable task. Just to, I guess from the other side, from what Emma was saying, was I think, you know, in East Kilbride and other places in South Lanarkshire, there are very important wildlife corridors along river corridors and woodlands and so forth that absolutely are critical to the way that settlement functions and how people use them, and they had to be in the quality assessment. There was no way, you know, you couldn't do it. You couldn't have been said to do a holistic assessment of that settlement if you didn't do a qualitative assessment of those natural spaces that were key to that particular settlement. So we definitely included those.
Thanks. Ivan, did you want to come in on this one?
Just very quickly, although I think Alice sort of more or less said what I was going to say. I did have a bit of a sharp intake of breath when Emma said, "Oh, we just left all the woodlands and natural spaces out of the."
I saw you vanish off my screen, and I thought you'd fallen over at that point, Ivan.
I did slightly fall off my chair, but I'm sure, you know, if I looked at the things that Emma had excluded, you know, I'm sure they'd be perfectly sensible, you know. And as Ali said, if it's the councils owns it and are managing it and can actually action things that will affect that space, then, you know, there's a very clearly a good reason to do a detailed quality audit of it. Spaces and woodland are fantastic areas for play as well. So, you know, provided there is some kind of, you know, it's well, again, it's an open question, isn't it, about what we do with those spaces in terms of play, and maybe do nothing is the answer, and it's fine, and we just recognise it, and that's that. But it's a challenge.
Okay, I think what we're kind of recognising from that is there does need to be that degree of pragmatism kind of coming in around what spaces go through that full quality assessment and so on. I can see some hands still up, but I'm conscious of time, and I wanted just to try to draw this together in terms of where do we go now with this, because that's kind of where we came in terms of recognising that we've got people who've done work already and are committed to a baseline. You know, and we had conversations there, you know, this audit started in 2015 or 2013, so we had to keep carrying on with this. And then we've got at that other end, you know, particularly for some of the agencies saying it would be really helpful if there's a degree of standardization. And I think we've also picked up in that conversation elements around the need to prioritize, the need kind of a hierarchy, the need to be efficient in terms of using our time and being smart about what we do. So it's not necessarily, you know, creating almost like a student project where we've audited everything and you get to the end and go, and so what? We've spent 10 years doing this and it's like painting the Forth Bridge. We need to go back to the beginning again. It's actually got to be meaningful and kind of action orientated in terms of what we do. So I'm kind of trying to take us back to thinking about one of the things we've got is we've got that sifting down of the criteria that we know Ali's done, we know Emma's done, and I think we could probably go to other authorities and say, okay, what are the ones that you actually really doing? And I think we've heard around some of those 5 kind of themes that were still coming through with climate and so on added into that. And so I'm thinking particularly about that slide that Kristin started with around those outcomes that we've got that local authorities will be looking for within their open space strategy, and whether that is that starting point coming in, doing that analysis that Kristin had done towards the end of that presentation of taking those key outcomes, plotting in what we've got in terms of criteria and really trying to hone down into some of the key essential ones in that. And if we started with, you know, those that Ali and Emma had got, and then looked at where we've got the gaps and are missing, whether that seems a sensible way forward for this. I can see a few nods. Sue's kind of nodding there. So it's that element of how do we get started in this? Because I think we're absolutely clear that we've got a proliferation of guidance and tools out there. We've got things that are duplicating, and actually what we want to do is try to align as much as possible and streamline. So I was wondering if we do that route in terms of those outcomes, that would also perhaps help us plot some gaps. And it might be that we can bring this group, or perhaps an expanding group, and actually do this in sort of more breakout groups where we take each of those outcomes in turn and work through. So that's kind of just what distilled into my head as I've been listening to the conversation this afternoon. So I'll go and open the floor to see if anybody's got thoughts in terms of how we move this forward, in terms of trying to get a degree of standardization, but with flexibility, I think is almost what we're trying to get. Emma, can I bring you in?
Yeah, thank you. I do agree with that. I know when I was looking at narrowing ours down, I looked at what Glasgow had done, and they had a slightly smaller list. I found some on there which weren't relevant necessarily. And one of the things that sprung to mind when you talk about the outcomes is our ability to assess them in terms of our technical knowledge. So one of the outcomes is going to obviously be linked to climate change, but I don't know how well I would be able to assess a site's contribution to climate change. So we do need to be careful when we're doing that, that the criteria of someone, if you have to imagine that you are standing looking at a green space and whether you can make that judgment call, because most of the criteria we're using are based on what you're experiencing on site. Obviously accessibility is not one of those in terms of the walking distance. But yeah, just to keep that pragmatic. One thing that occurred to me when Ivan was speaking, I completely agree that woodlands are playable spaces, but councils cannot identify a space as a play space unless they know it's safe. And it's something we're going to have to be very, very cautious of with the place efficiency assessment in terms of liability, because I cannot, as an officer of the council, legitimately say to someone that woodland is a play space, because if they go in there and their child, and on my word that it is a place forced play, and their child gets hurt, that that's not something we can take on. So we will be extremely cautious around the kinds of spaces that we will formally in writing say are playable spaces, because the safety is and the liability, we're not going to do that. Doesn't mean a space isn't playable, but we're not going to say it.
I mean, Margaret, I know I saw Marguerite's hand pop up there, and I don't want us to necessarily at this point go down that place efficiency assessment route, but I think I do just really want to flag up, the Land Reform Act at the moment gives you that right to play, access and for play in those sites. So I think, this issue around liability and so on, and whether you're designating it effectively as a play space as opposed to the fact that it has place efficiency and is playable, is something slightly different. And I know that Kwan and Marguerite are going to be working through that one. Okay, Ivan, can I bring you in relation to that element of the next steps in terms of the quality work? You're on mute, Ivan.
I was going to say I'm not going to comment on the thing about woods and playable spaces, other than to say we're all thinking hard about it. But I really liked, just going back to the beginning, I think the outcomes are the one thing that we all want to see and that there's agreement on. So I absolutely agree that's the starting point for everything that flows from that. That's the top of the hierarchy, I guess. But just a reminder that the outcomes are for the open space, that they're outcomes for the open space strategy, not outcomes from a quality assessment. So I think going forward, we need to think, well, what are the outcomes of a quality assessment of a space, and what are the outcomes of the OSS, and how might we actually assess an OSS as a product in terms of how it delivers on those outcomes as well. So it's two slightly different things.
Yeah.
No, sorry. Yeah, just the third thing was that I think we are coalescing around a kind of a menu options type approach, rather than a you will do this in such and such a way. I think we're talking about, well, here's a menu of things to consider. Here's different ways you could answer the question with evidence. And it's that sort of offering, I think, rather than a you must do it this way. But I think the outcomes are the starting point, and I think there's agreement around that.
Yeah. Okay. Kristen? Oh, sorry. Hadriaka, do you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, just very quickly in terms of how you sort of identify the criteria, I agree with Emma that you sort of need to think, how could you answer this question when you're standing on site, but you might also need to think about how could you answer it depending on your background. We did our quality assessment template, like check. I did it as a planning officer, and then a landscape architect colleague did it, and it was quite different how we were viewing that space. So it's just something that also worth thinking about. What background will the person have?
Yeah, and I think that's when the kind of community view comes to the fore as well. Just so it's not just one or two people making that judgment, but it's almost like we were speaking with Julie the other day. It's almost like you have like the kind of slimline capsule criteria, but then there's also maybe that second half, which is like the community views and how that affects the kind of quality overall judgment for that site or locality. Just a minor technical points on what Ivan was saying about the outcomes being for the open space strategy, maybe not so much for the audit. Under the Act, the audit is technically part of the strategy and so will be covered by the outcome. If that's clear.
No, okay, that's helpful. And I think, you know, what's just been talked about there is that element about quality is a very, some of the elements of it are quite subjective, and that is a challenge, and different professional backgrounds. And I think what we can look at in terms of the guidance is how you would approach some of those. And that might be an opportunity, as Tom was talking about, around, you know, working with other services on some of this as well. And I think there's that element as well around what can we have from data that could perhaps be provided nationally that could help. And then that element around the customer kind of, sorry, probably you shouldn't use the word customer, but the community, the user kind of interface. And I think, you know, the fact of technology developments there now. So I think that's something we should be talking to e-planning colleagues as well to start looking at how we could bring that in. So there is a question, is anybody aware of any authority at the moment who's got a fairly sophisticated digital or app-based system where they are engaging with communities around spaces? I see shaking of heads. Nope. Okay. Okay. Ali, your hand popped up there. Can I bring you in?
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, it was just to flag up that in terms of that type of community involvement, by definition, you're probably going to exclude those groups who may not be likely to use local spaces or to feedback and find that the fact that they find them inaccessible in some way. So I think that can't be the only method. It needs to be part of a package of how do you explore how different groups within your community find their open spaces.
Yes, it's a method that already is biased towards the people who are using the spaces, and actually what we need to know is who doesn't and why they don't. So yeah, you're absolutely right on that one. Yeah, excellent. Yeah, Ivan, can I bring you in?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not aware of any particular sort of consultation packages just around green spaces, but I think there's been a whole bunch of new apps and new products available because of COVID, and new approaches to community consultation. So I'm aware of one at North Mary Hill. They used a kind of community consultation package. So that was around the transformational regeneration area. And I actually, you know, Edinburgh Council has used online consultations for things like new approaches to car parking on my street, but actually really well managed, and it involved maps and so on, and it enabled you to actually write comments on places on the map. So there are packages being out there and available, but that would, you know, do the same job effectively.
Yeah, and I think in some of the initial conversations we've been having with our digital colleagues, they've been highlighting some of these types of tools. I think there's one they've been working on called Place Builder, which again, it's got that map base and you can kind of drop pins on and write a comment, and it could be an open box just for any comments, or it could be like a sliding scale, so 1 to 5 or whatever it is. So there's different ways that you can make spatial comments or more general ones, but it's something that we're keen to pick up with them later in the year. But it's almost like what comes first, you know, our conversations, the digital conversations, and just how it all works and hangs together as well with their other priorities as well, I should say.
And there's always that challenge of just because we can do something digitally doesn't necessarily mean we should do that. And thinking about digital exclusion and a whole host of other things as well. And I think it's that element of being clear what it is we actually want. What is the question we need to answer to this, which can then form, a detailed specification for those digital colleagues. So we'll bear that certainly in mind.
So
Tom,
the other very quick, really the other really quick, really boring thing, but we need to consider is that this can't be a kind of a PDF thing. It's got to be an accessible, because the new accessibility legislation, whatever we produce has to be accessible to everyone, which means it can't be a PDF, generally speaking, or it has to be other things if it's a PDF.
Yeah, I was just going to say quickly, I can't remember the name of it, but there's these QR codes that the council has used for community consultations where you just use your camera and it brings up 1 or 2 questions. And again, thinking about Ali's point later, it's kind of these things that you see in the airports when you tick, did you have a good experience, yes or no? Things like that are quite useful, and I don't know if there's other technologies around there that could be quite useful just to gather this kind of information.
Yeah, the one that sadly that always comes into my mind is the motorway services, about how clean the toilets were, and that smiley face, miserable face, and so on. So yeah, and I think as well, something we were talking about, Boris, is I know that, and I can't remember the name of the organisation, a US parks-based organisation that has done some of this work as well. So I think there might be a little bit of scoping to find out what's in development, what's happening elsewhere. So, Kristin, does that give us a helpful way forward if we take the outcomes approach? I hesitate to use the word logic models, but I'm kind of seeing some of that kind of coming through in terms of tracking back to some of the indicators we might use, and that very sort of condensed capsule of key criteria that we would use.
Definitely. I think your idea is of, if I get Ali and Emma's capsule or condensed criteria, and then I can initially map those across the outcomes, and then maybe we can come together again and just flash through them sort of outcome by outcome and just see how that goes. But no, it's been really useful, I think, definitely.
And I think the other thing it would be useful to do is thinking about the wider group as well. Some of the specialisms we've got on there. So I was thinking about colleagues in relation to from SEPA or from Scottish Water when we're thinking about some of those climate resilient type criteria as well. So there might be opportunities to engage with others. And we've got Ali and Liz on the call, but thinking very much around the health and well-being outcomes and making sure that we don't go down that kind of lowest common denominator, which is just about sport, exercise and physical activity, and particularly that element around sort of inclusion and health inequalities there as well. So, yeah.
We've just had an internal approach in the past couple of days about sort of green space and mental health, and I don't know if there's criteria that we can put in around that as well. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, and I think that's certainly one of the things that we've discovered through a lot of the survey work during the pandemic is the importance of green space in terms of people's, mental health and well-being as much as physical activity as well. So yes, and Ivan's just put up about the green and blue network opportunities, and they've got work on sort of ecological coherence planning and as well, and some of the approaches they've used for that are quite helpful. So I think one of the things that would be good to say is if there's any thoughts that you have after today, please feel free to fire them through to myself, to Kristin or Kwan, because I know sometimes you have these conversations and it's kind of like a day or so later, a light bulb pings on in your mind and we think about it. If there are other colleagues in other local authorities that you've been talking to, when you've been doing your work and they've come down to those condensed criteria, please do put them in touch, because I think it'd be useful to kind of do almost a bit of that crowdsourcing of those criteria, and then we can go back through the HOPS network as well when we come up with a kind of first iteration to actually look at how well that would work for colleagues in other areas as well. But thank you very much. It's been a really interesting conversation this afternoon. We set this off, as I said at the beginning, thinking this is really showing out our workings, because we hadn't got an answer, but we knew that it was quite a complex challenge to work out how we found that balance between not changing the status quo, but coming up with something that has a degree of standardization. So thank you very much for all of your contributions and your input today. And I think the lesson I'm going to take away from this is that whatever we come up with, we need to give it a really thorough road testing and ground testing before we actually put anything out. And I think that's learning by experience from that. The first with the quality guide with Ali is that we spent so much time getting that all together, and we did all of those consultations, but actually we didn't really go out and field test it, and I think that was probably because we were coming to the end of a financial year and the grant had to be finished at that point, which is just one of those inconsiderate elements. But I think that absolute, rigorous road testing is going to be really important. So Kristen, Kwan, any kind of final closing words from either of you?
No, it was just something that when you were talking about the different approaches and finding the answer, I was very struck with when Ali C said, there are no right answers, and it is about, as we work together and do the best that we can, and we'll certainly be striving for that, but allowing that flexibility so that there's different strokes for different folks again. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, echoing what Kristen's just said, I mean, we learned quite a lot listening to everybody, and it's really, really helpful. And I think it's about finding that balance, as you said. It's not an exact science, and it's not a piece of big research that we're doing. It's remembering the outcomes is about better people's quality of life as well, and that's what we try to get to. And Emma, if you don't mind, I'd like to follow up with you whilst you're on the journey thinking about play and things. It's trying to get that in my brain as well, and maybe have a discussion sort of offline and sort of see how we go from there.
Absolutely, no problem.
Thank you.
Yeah, because that is another key thing, is weaving the place efficiency assessment through the quality assessment as well. Yeah. And I think that integration is absolutely critical. Yeah. So excellent. We're not going to put a date in the diary at this point. We'll roll this forward, and Kristen will do that first analysis. We'll come back to you maybe by email in the first instance, and then pull back a group together to take this forward. So, Cherie. I've got a real hand and a pretend hand. So Cherie and then Kristen.
It was just to say on that with Midlothian, we can also give contacts for Play Midlothian, who might be able to do some consultation work with children and young people. So you might get, Midlothian might be quite a good sort of case study or sort of trial place in the round, because I know some of the folk that were involved in developing the play strategy in Midlothian. And there were council officers, so probably different council officers, so some other part of the council had involvement. So it's just, it's that sort of, right, so we involved them, but well, actually, I wasn't involved in the play strategy in Midlothian, but someone involved someone, but they maybe just didn't involve the right people. So it's getting that sort of, who do we need around the table?
You never know, Midlothian could become the absolute testbed, because they're also an area we're looking at in terms of the green prescribing framework. Midlothian Health and Social Care Partnership are in the lead again around that, and that again strong links in terms of how we're using those spaces to realise those outcomes. So
it's a cracking wee place is Midlothian, so and
it's good to bring attention over to the east sometimes, where we normally focus on the west.
And we're very small as well. We're something like the second smallest authority in Scotland, so we're only teeny tiny.
Yeah, good. Okay. And Kristen, final word to you.
Yeah, it was just the final words, and it's kind of linked to timing. So Kwan and I are busy working with our lawyers, but hoping to get the consultation package of the draft proposals for the regulations out over the summer. And you'll anticipate from this conversation that we won't have the full kind of quality model kind of worked up by then. So it's maybe just a slight plea that if those people in local authorities, if you can kind of be ambassadors and spread that message that we are really working on this and it is coming, and not to kind of backlash that there's not all the guidance, when we go out to consult, just to kind of get that kind of that we are having these positive conversations, if that's possible.
Yeah. It's better to take the time to get it right than just get something done by a deadline. So yeah, good. Okay, thank you all very much for joining us on this meeting bus. There wasn't as much coming toing and froing as we anticipated, but thanks very much for all of you for your contributions, and we'll be in touch. Take care.
Thank you for a great
Thank you.
Thank you.
Interesting conversations. Did that get us where we wanted to be? I think.
Yeah, I think it was. I think it was quite a positive conversation and sort of good responses, and good to see what they're all working on. And